But this also extends to people like acquaintances, people who somewhat know you through work, somewhat know you through family, etc., and also can give some degree of explanation as to what your characters are. Because in essence, if in court you are a character witness and you can say that you've known this person to a certain extent, the judge obviously won't buy you as much as they buy a close friend, but they will still give some degree of veracity to your statement. So insofar as this debate acknowledges that we can have individuals who are not just close friends, we tell you that this is where you disproportionately dishevel the playing field for like reasonable convictions to be given to individuals based on objective metrics. Before I move on to, I'm going to just do two things in my speech, very simple. I'm going to talk about opening opposition, closing opposition, and tell you why our extension went unresponded. Let's start with closing opposition, because their entire extension, which was two things. The first they told us is that we need good amounts of sentencing and that we need to know what the backgrounds are, because the next level is that we also shouldn't give sentences and we should mitigate stereotypes and understanding this person's background through these particular character witnesses, we reduce stereotypes. But this entire extension is contingent on the literal contention in this debate, which is the veracity of the character witnesses and whether or not it's biased or not. Insofar as we contest and tell you there's a greater ability for you to have falsified information or like severely biased information as a result, what Tasia told you earlier about social trends, people hating sexual assault and jumping on the bandwagon, you reduce the credibility of that extension. So that extension doesn't say in this debate, insofar as they tell us there is a greater ability for, that the information and character witnesses you get more often than not is not a consequence of hatred, vengeance, or internalized stereotypes, right? So that's closing opposition. And this is where it gets a bit interesting, because they had three things to say in their speeches. Firstly, they told us that there is equal ability for everyone, this was an Amrit speech, to counter a character witness. So if anyone has a character witness, there's always a counter character witness. To which opening opposition said that if you're Kevin Spacey, you will have a lot more, which is somewhat reasonable. But Tasia took this further. When we exploit racist structures that exist in society, you are less likely to have African Americans coming out in court to say, you're less likely to have like a judge that is willing to reconsider the character witnesses of, say, like Brock Turner. So as a consequence of this, and white supremacy being something that's internalized, you give judges and people who pass sentences the ability to use an arbitrary metric, which is values and characteristics, to extend a certain person's sentence or reduce them. So in their world, literally, their second argument was that people will lose trust in the criminal justice system and it will be less racist. That is the counter of what is going to happen in their world. As a consequence of their policy, you're going to have more people like Brock Turner, like white people, being able to get away with the fact that they can like literally just bring a lot of character witnesses in their favor and say that, hey, we've got all these characteristics. And your judge, who already has a predisposition to care about your particular race, or contrarily, a predisposition to screw you over for your particular race, will act on these as valid and legitimate grounds to. So we've already proven to you how this is an avenue for these judges to push it a lot further. Before I move on to the third thing they said in opening opposition, I'll take Max.
Let's say the case is about assault. Right? If I can prove that this person is a person who has never had any history of fighting despite working in a very hostile environment for many years, these are not arbitrary but quite objective. Can you explain to me your white supremacist argument? How you will be able to escape a white person just by telling I'm white?
So let's talk about this sexual assault thing, because it's pretty important as well, right? How does this contextualize, right? So let's assume that this white person is a person that committed sexual assault and has been convicted to have molested a certain person. Now we want to understand what the characters of this person are. So we bring in character witnesses, recognizing that there are social trends in status quo, which means people generally hate sexual assailants. People generally hate rapists and don't want to protect them. And there's aversion to protecting these particular individuals. You are going to have less individuals who are not related to this person coming out and speaking about this person, which means that maybe the close friend of this white guy is going to come out and say he's a good guy. But also recognize that by virtue of him being a close friend, it's also a reason in their world to second guess the veracity of this information, which means the closer you are, the more likely you are to be biased. So there's a contention here. That means insofar as it doesn't mean that just because you are a person that is distant from this particular person, it means that the information you get necessarily is like not true, right? It also means that it is less biased. So there's a contention, right? So like insofar as there are more individuals who generally buy in, so his acquaintances come out and say, yes, this one time I heard him say this perverted thing in the workplace environment, or if he's a friend and he generally believes that this person is a pervert. None of these actually matter in terms of ascertaining the degree and the extent of consequences of his crime and what he has done. Insofar as you acknowledge that, you cannot give credibility to these particular, no thank you, what's it called again? Criminal, that character witnesses, right? Yeah. So the next thing we'll say is that if a person, and this is where they told us that there is ability for you to have, that we question and challenge the beyond reasonable doubt status in their world, right? And Amrit told us that the system can ascertain what is biased and what isn't biased. But here's where it's problematic, right? Because she told us that yes, we will know it's biased, but biased information is still information. But this is contradictory, because in their world, if the information is biased and they know it's biased, then it's less valuable. So like you need to assume that it's true. You need to assume that it's less biased, and you need to give some credibility to this particular information. If you concede to that, and if you concede and you say, yes, there is some credibility to this information, this applies to both the close friends and the disproportionate amount of people who are going to come out against this particular person. At the end of the day, it's simple. This is an arbitrary policy that allows individuals to use their arbitrary values to act upon prejudices and to also act upon intentions that may not be within the legal realm. This means it can manifest in racist structures. This means it can manifest in a world where people can take it out upon themselves to enact, to provide sentences that don't afford people the benefit of the doubt before necessarily pushing on this prejudice onto them. With all that said, never been prouder to propose.
I can be Eric is so cute. Oh no, this is round 5 minus help. Round 4 minus help.
Oh, yeah,
exactly round 4. Yeah.
That's why the topic is 5 rounds.
That's true.
4, why not? No.
Oh, is it 4 rounds?
Yeah.
And good. Hey. You can put him here. I mean, take us wrong. Actually, yes. Style.
In council and big bang.
Oh, yeah. But is this still going?
To be outside the way.
Oh, I posted a amendment also, right?
Nice, this is actually being live streamed.
Yeah, we have to change all the shell to must and should. I'm gonna fix this. Yeah. I just go back. Siron is watching. Yeah. Yeah, here.
All right. Ironically, when giving judgment about a debate, essentially about the capacity of judges to differentiate things that we feel are pretty obvious, it comes down to the weaknesses inside government when they obviously choose to select and cherry pick specific examples of cases that are convenient to them. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why the only example we got throughout this entire debate are cases of sexual assault and not robbery for basic need. All right, a few things to deal with first. On the arbitrary measure of whether or not this information is arbitrary. Believe that you can settle this clash by looking at what it takes to become a judge, kind of training a judge goes through, and the kind of integrity judges naturally need to stand by. In responding to this, you can look to the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, yeah, there are black judges in the United States. Racism isn't some blanket policy by a deep state. We believe that there are cases whereby these judges can tell apart the difference and the credibility between these character weaknesses. A judge is not going to be blind to the fact that you knew a guy just for 5 hours versus you knew the guy for a long, long time. We don't believe judges lose this capacity for rationality just because some magical character weakness comes forward. We believe that judges are smarter than that, something unfortunately I needed to say. But also, on distance to the criminal, and how I'm going to resolve this clash, because a lot of material coming from side government was that brothers and sisters or people close to these witnesses will be biased towards them. Well, I'll deal with this with an even if. Even if these people are somewhat biased, we tell you the judge knows that it's your bro that's coming forward to talk about you. That biasness is accounted for by the judge. But this biasness needs to be accepted because of the price of this biasness, or what we are accommodating this bias for. With this bias comes truthful information. The only way you get to know a person truly, or a person's character, is by spending a long amount of time with the person. True enough results in some level of bias, but I told you already that judges are smarter than that. The biasness can be accounted for in the system, and once you pass that accountability of bias, you realize that the cost of it is truly justified, which is accuracy of information. This makes it a lot harder to be a character weakness. And you shouldn't believe government when they tell you that anyone can randomly become a character weakness and be recruited as some form of currency. Moving on to things that they needed to engage with but never truly did. We talked about how it informs society as a whole, and you break stereotypes. This helps society in a sense, so we disprove the fact that anyone can be a criminal. But it's really important to talk about characterization here because it humanizes the individual. This is where side closing steps apart from opening, because outside of weird rape examples, we gave you specific characterization on why it's sometimes important to acknowledge that degrees of punishment are necessary, something that they never engage with. We see parallels in law where there are varying degrees of murder based on negligence to outright something that's premeditated for years on end. We feel that character weaknesses as a whole mirror this parallel in law because the law aims to be something that is truly meritocratic. We believe that malicious intent is something that needs to be thought about in in deciding the amount of sentencing for people. But also unengaged from side government was how you need to know the devils within these people. You need to know the causes of their actions. You need to know why specifically they chose to do these things. This is really important, and the amount of time they spend in jail is also really important because of the nature of the criminal justice system. You need to separate hardcore criminals from softcore criminals, in a sense whereby these people need to spend the least amount of time in prison. Because on further nuancing, you realize that the longer the amount of time you spend in prison, the more distant you grow from the society that anchors you to appropriate forms of behavior. This is really important when talking about things like rehabilitation of people. That's why when Eric told you how you need to know how to rehabilitate people, it was unengaged by side government, probably because of the how true it is that you need to know how much time you need to send these people into prison. Also on degrees of punishment, we believe that degrees of punishment are something that they completely unengaged with. They assume that all crimes are equal to a certain extent. This does not engage with anything coming from outside opposition at all about the different circumstances in which criminals perpetrate their acts. A criminal can be starving, for example. A criminal feels the need to rob, to live up to, or to support a family. We believe that these are credible instances whereby the person doesn't deserve to go to jail because of a system that oppresses the person. The system doesn't have the right to penalize the person as much. Closing.
So this person that you're talking about has one bro, and the bro says that he's a solid guy, he's super biased, and you can know that he's biased because he's a close friend. But also has 10 people say he's a horrible guy by virtue of judging this person's actions and cherry-picking bad attributes. How will you ascertain this bias in 10 people?
We believe that a judge has a lot of metrics to work with here. The word of one bro versus a lot of people that have cumulatively spent very little time, right? Which is why 10 cheap witnesses are never going to be as much as one decent person. But also, I think a judge is capable of ascertaining the nature or credibility of what this bro says due to the realism of it all. We believe that judges in general are not losing their rationality when these character witnesses are coming for, due to the nature of objective metrics that also exist within character witnesses, such as the amount of time spent with the person. Now, what have I talked about? I talked about the unengaged material, such as knowing the causes of crime, the degrees of punishment, and how it informs society as general. And I've solved the various clashes on why it is in fact not arbitrary, and the judge does have the capacity and should have the capacity to pick and choose when these things are needed, and it shouldn't be banned from the court processes. Proud to oppose.
I think the teams for the debate, I'd like to invite you guys to cross the floor and shake hands.
Who do you see now?
Oh, please.
This is that.
Off it.